Welcome to Liberty Starship, where we go beyond the typical terrestrial talk. I am Eric Alexander, along with Peter Maines. Together we are your crew and invite you to join us on the journey to discuss politics and current events. And I'm happy to say that we're bringing back Daily Distractions today in full force. And Pete actually has a story today.
I do. If you could throw it up here, this is the biggest story that the mainstream media won't tell you. Well, some of them will, because clearly that's where we got this. But baboons are now arming themselves with knives and chainsaws in UK safari parks. We reported in past weeks how monkey gangs have been on the streets of Thailand, fighting each other over popcorn and anything else they can find. This growing monkey gang problem has really gotten out of control, and we haven't seen either of the major candidates for president take it seriously. It's been in Thailand and India, and now in the UK. It's clearly spreading. They are strong, self-replicating, and highly intelligent. Now their candidates agree to come on our show to discuss this, and we urge you not to support any candidate who does not take the simian menace seriously.
It's funny because this has been sort of an ongoing story that we actually you got away from it for a while, but it looks like it's back in full force now, huh?
Yeah. Yes. If people don't know, we have in fact reported on monkeys doing all kinds of crazy things, including forming gangs, because as tourists have gone away from places like Thailand, what is happening is the monkeys are now hungry. They're not getting the popcorn that they used to get, and they kind of go a little bit crazy. They start fighting over turf, not unlike, well, human beings, I guess. So, and obviously this is all a bit tongue-in-cheek about the media, how they hype stories and they hype our fears. So, well, with that, I think you have another daily distraction.
Yeah, mine isn't quite as goofy, but it's close. It's close. It's definitely close. I like to, of course, find stuff on some of the big mainstream media sites, and I always try to go with something that's on the main page. And CNN helps me so much sometimes with these articles. Now, this is actually topical, but it's the way that they're talking about it and why they're talking about it that makes it a distraction to me. So this is a CNN headline right from today. It says, Mike Ditka says kneeling athletes should, quote, get the hell out of the country. Now, anybody who's familiar with Mike Ditka is probably not surprised at all by that statement. And of course, that's just red meat for both sides, because with all the polarization that goes on right now, of course, you're going to have one side saying, right on, Mike, good for you. And the other side saying, oh, he's a racist, he's a jerk, blah, 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 blah. But if you go down this article, you realize they didn't just randomly go to Mike Ditka to try to get an inflammatory response from him. No, there's a context of why they're talking to him. The reason they're talking to him is because Ditka is the chairman of the X League. Now, Pete, do you know what the X League is?
Yeah, it's the other football league. Didn't they shut it down in halfway through the season this year?
You're thinking of the XFL. This is
X is separate.
League.
This is different.
This is separate.
Oh, no, I haven't heard of this.
Okay, so the X League was once known as the Lingerie Football League. It was rebranded as the Legends Football League in 2013. In 2019, the Legends Football League announced that it would be shutting down. The league was rebranded once again as the Extreme Football League, or X League. So that's why they were talking to Mike Ditka about this issue, because apparently they are getting ready to get the old lingerie football league going again. And Mike Ditka is a chairman, and I guess he does not want his athletes to be kneeling during the national anthem.
So let me get this straight. The female football league is not called the Women's NFL or the Women's American Football League or something like that. It's called the Extreme League.
That's what it's called now. Originally, this is the old lingerie football league. If you're not familiar, there was a football league that featured female athletes in lingerie. Full contact, by the way, with pads and the whole deal and all that kind of a thing. And it's gone through numerous, reincarnations. They keep trying to get it back. They actually had a television deal for a while. That's why I know about them. They were actually on, live broadcast TV, I think, on my CW affiliate. They're still going strong, apparently. And Mike Ditka is their chairman. He's their boss.
I didn't know they were still going strong. Have you,
Strong is a relative term in this
sure.
conversation.
Have you looked into season tickets?
I have not yet. This is actually the first that I heard about the fact that they were quote unquote coming back. And now, I guess some people would argue, hey, they never really left.
And that's fine if you have a sport that and they have gotten away from the more raunchy lingerie league, because they do have to wear pads. This is a dangerous thing. You can't just get burns all over your body. As I understand it, if they're changing the name, seems they're trying to sort of clean up its image at the very least. But Extreme League, sorry. And not to be confused with the Extreme Football League. This is an extreme league of football, kind of like the Los Angeles Angels of Anaheim. Could this not be a trademark infringement? It seems like it would have to be, because I just got confused right now when you mentioned this other extreme league that happens to play football, but is not the Extreme Football League.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Although I think right now there's a big question mark as far as whether the XFL is going to be back. I mean, the XFL seems kind of cursed because obviously they tried years ago to get their league going. It was a failure. They reorganized in the wake of another league, which was the AAF. I actually went to one of their games because they had a team in Arizona, and they got
the Rattlers.
Not the Rattlers. No, you're talking about arena football. This was the Alliance of American Football. They actually had a team in Arizona. I actually went to one of their games. They actually went bankrupt, owed ASU a bunch of money because they got some deal where they didn't have to pay them for the stadium. I don't know how that works, but they came out the year before, last year, I guess, where are we at?
Okay.
Right now? XFL came back in 2020. Alliance of American Football came in 2019. They were trying to beat XFL's, comeback to the punch, and they did, but they failed.
Yeah.
The next XFL came out. People actually were really liking it. As far as I could tell, people were actually liking the new version of the XFL. And then COVID hit and destroyed them once again. I know they've officially, I think they said they're coming back. I think there's a big question whether they are. And my guess is that this is speculation. I'm just guessing that the X League here is pretty much counting on their demise and saying we're going to go ahead and basically kind of use their name because maybe we'll get some more viewers because we have this confusion going on. That's a speculation on my part because you're right. It's very confusing. If you hear X League, you're going to assume it's the XFL, especially if you associate it with football. So it's I think there's some method to the madness there, though. I'll say that. Because it's always good to do something like that if you can get away with it.
Right. Well, even if you shut down the corporation, though, I don't know that they could. Well, I don't know that the trademark necessarily goes away just because they canceled the season. They may still own the trademark. Somebody owns a trademark with the idea that they might restart it again in the future because it was very successful. I mean, people liked watching it. It was decent football. It was a decent product. It wasn't. It wasn't like professional curling or something. It was something that people actually wanted to watch. So,
yeah, I agree with you. But I said, I think they're kind of counting on their demise at this point, and it looks like that's what they're doing. I mean, they said that they're going to make their debut in April of 2021.
Not a bet I would make.
Website. So, yes, everyone, the Lingerie Football League is back. Now we do actually have a comment from Vivian Lawrence, and she says, "Nice show," with a nice little heart there. Vivian, thank you very much. We appreciate the compliment and appreciate you tuning in. Thank you very much.
All right. What's the next story you want to talk about? The housing market, is that right?
We're not up to the housing market quite yet. I did have some breaking news, although that is definitely something that's trending quite a bit at the moment. I did want to briefly just talk about gold. We are, of course, I think mostly try to advocate for sound money on this show. Let me bring up the article real quick. This is a BBC article that I wanted to talk about. Actually, what's interesting also is I found out about this from someone who isn't really political. They actually were just talking about this, and it was kind of interesting to see that this is on people's minds, because that's context I want to put this in, is that this is someone that's not political. This is on my personal page that I saw someone talking about and tweeting this article. BBC News says gold hits record highs as investor jitters spread. And it says gold hit a record high on Monday as increasing numbers of nervous investors sought a safe place to put their money. It's kind of interesting in the context of all this. This article does try to kind of say what's going on a little bit. And they do put this into the context of the current crisis with China involving the closure of one of their consulates, which apparently was done because there was some allegations of spying going on at the Chinese consulate at Houston. Since then, the Chinese have then gone ahead and closed one of our consulates in China. So there's sort of a tension growing between the two countries, and this has caused a hit to the dollar, and it looks like a lot of people are fleeing to gold.
I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised this is happening at all, because the last time we saw gold spike like this, it was during the 2008 crisis. And so when people are afraid, they go to gold. And what also happened during the last crisis? Well, you had trillions of dollars pumped into the economy by Congress in the form of TARP and other relief programs. So, if nothing else, this is a vote by investors. They believe inflation is or could be on the way, and this is a hedge against possible inflation. Now, we didn't see massive inflation in the wake of the 2008 crisis. We pumped the money in, but we did so less directly. We did so through the banking system with the idea then that we could unwind it later. This time, we're making direct cash payments to people. So it's a little bit different. It's a little dicier. I think it's a little riskier what we're doing right now, but of course, it's something that really has to be done because people are sitting at home. They're not getting their paychecks. And what else are you going to do? I mean, let's be honest here. These relief payments will continue at least until the election. At that point, maybe you'll see politicians have a change of heart, or maybe the coronavirus will have receded. But for the foreseeable future, Congress is going to keep printing and spending money.
Yes, and this is being also done in the context of right now, another breaking news story is that the Senate just had their economic stimulus proposal come out, which is very different from the one in the House that came from the Democrats. So there's going to be a lot of going back and forth, accusations back and forth about who's helping who, for what reason, blah, 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 yada, yada, yada. But this article also mentions that silver also rose more than 6% to almost $25 an ounce. Its highest since September 2013. I feel good about that because I actually own some silver. Unlike gold, I actually own some silver.
Yeah. And silver, as I recall, I don't have the chart in front of me, but that's had a much rougher road than gold. Gold has been going up for really the past 5 years, although it's accelerated in the past few months. So this is a big turnaround for silver, and I think that tells you a lot about what's going on in the market right now. That people really are worried about inflation. This isn't just isolated to gold.
Now, obviously, we don't give financial advice on this show, but I think both of us are advocates of sound money, and I think it's just common sense to make sure that you have a diverse portfolio that does include some element of precious metals. I think that's a good move. This might not be the time to buy, though. This might not be the time to buy. If you're betting that it's going to go even higher, which it could, it may be, sure, but this may not be the time to buy for you and get into the market. You're probably feeling a little bit better if you have some gold or silver already, but this may not be exactly the time to buy.
Right. And last time this happened, last time that gold reached this point, what the Federal Reserve did was they crushed interest rates. They crushed gold through what was called Operation Twist. It was a redo of a program that had been run during the Eisenhower administration, and it was designed to keep the price of commodities and other inflation-sensitive sectors of the economy down, so as to basically to contain expectations of inflation and thereby inflation itself.
Makes sense. Makes a lot of sense. Now, I had in kind of relation to this article, I had another thing I just wanted to talk about because, again, this was something that was brought to my attention by someone who was not political, and they brought this to my attention last week. And the funny thing was, at first, I couldn't find any good information on this. Now, looking today, There's all sorts of hyper-partisan articles, one way or the other, some praising the president as they do, some condemning the president as they do. But I found this very, very simple article from this site called BeckersHospitalReview.com. And it said, Trump signs 4 executive orders targeting drug prices, 6 things you need to know. Because I didn't know what was going on here. I just got a random text from a friend of mine who's not political and said, hey, this is really cool. You should check this out. So it said the first of these executive orders will require federally qualified health centers to pass discounts on insulin and EpiPens directly to patients. The second order will allow states, wholesalers, and pharmacies to import FDA-approved drugs from Canada and other countries where the drug price is significantly lower. The third order will direct drug rebates to patients in an effort to simplify the system. It said it is unclear when orders 1 through 3 will be finalized and take effect. The fourth, more sweeping order, which I think is actually what people are really excited about, will require Medicare to purchase drugs at the same price paid by other economically advanced countries. However, President Trump will delay the implementation of the fourth order until August 24th to give pharmaceutical executives who strongly oppose the idea a chance to propose an alternative. He said he will meet with the drug companies at the White House on Tuesday, which is tomorrow. So just kind of cutting through all the bull, I wanted to put that out there. Again, this is a story that came to me from someone who's not political, who's very excited about this and thought it was interesting. And once he told me about it, I thought it was interesting as well. Pete, did you have any thoughts on this?
Well, I think it's certainly an interesting thing that we would be buying drugs at lower prices. You know, this has been an ongoing problem. And I want to talk about something, we can disagree with the president on many things, but if you look at the people that he's put in charge of the FDA, they have all been, to the best of my knowledge, cancer experts. I don't know about Scott Gottlieb, but a lot of them have come from the world of cancer research. And that's a big departure from previous administrations where they all came from the pharmaceutical world. And so essentially these are all people who favor higher drug prices, and then we wonder why the price of drugs is spiraling out of control. Under Obama, Margaret Hamburg, she's a doctor, an MD. She was the FDA commissioner under Obama, one of them. She had to resign her post. Her husband is the co-CEO of a hedge fund known as Renaissance Technologies. Renaissance Technologies gave $15 million to Hillary Clinton, $15 million to Donald Trump in the last election in the hopes that they would again assist them in insider trading, essentially. When Margaret Hamburg, the wife of Renaissance Technology co-CEO, the Renaissance Technologies co-CEO, when she was the FDA commissioner, she did use her position. She abused her position. She went to court. She was sued by, they call themselves like a watchdog, like non-governmental organization. And what the judge ruled was that it was not illegal to use your position as FDA commissioner to engage in insider trading. And like I said, they've continued to give huge donations. They were the largest donor to Donald Trump, and they were the third largest donor to Hillary Clinton, although they gave the same amount to each candidate. So it's absolutely obscene that we allow this to happen. And, you have to give Trump credit. He has not, it appears to me that he has not continued this shell game where we allow the pharmaceutical industry to continue to rip us off, where they continue to collude with officials at the FDA to keep drug prices artificially high. And like, what's that?
I did want to mention that one thing that I find interesting here is that I think the part, again, that I mentioned, I think people are most excited about is this fourth executive order to require Medicare to purchase drugs at the same price paid by other economically advanced countries. And now, as this article mentions, that particular provision has a delay in implementation because this is very Trump. This is very Trumpian. Trump likes to have leverage when he goes into the negotiating table on any issue. And so I think that's very much his style. And I think I think it's very much his intention to get it done one way or another, because I think that's very much the way that he works. It's very much the way that he thinks is he likes to have leverage. So this is a way, I think, to bring the pharmaceutical companies to the negotiating table as well.
That could be. And certainly it does make sense that if other countries are paying a certain price, for drugs that we should pay the same price. And this price discrimination, where they feel they can rip off American patients because we allow them to, well, it has to end. And but more than that, there are a lot of drugs that have been approved by foreign governments. Governments say in the EU. I can understand if you have a drug that's approved in, I don't know, Zambia or something like that, a third world nation, that maybe we would not want to have reciprocity, where we just trust their agency because we don't know what the infrastructure is there. But if the UK approves something, if Germany approves something, if Israel approves something, or Japan, first world nations, other economically developed nations, it just makes sense that we would have reciprocity between our FDA and theirs. And that's a big factor, it appears to me, that is driving up the cost of pharmaceutical drugs, and as a consequence, the price of healthcare for all Americans.
Yeah, certainly, at the very least, you would think that they would fast track, a drug in that particular category. That it seems to me that would be a no brainer. But I mean, that's bureaucracy. That's what bureaucracies do. Unfortunately, is they try to put impediments instead of trying to make things a little bit easier. Now, I do have another article that actually relates to one of our main topics here, because we're going to be talking about this eviction crisis. And I got a little question mark there as far as what's going on. So I almost felt like what I'm about to talk about here, I could have put as a daily distraction. Now, this article also came to my attention from someone else, but this is someone who actually is very politically astute. And I was a little surprised by what they were saying, and because I respect this person's position and all that kind of stuff. But they were basically talking about all the doom and gloom. They actually put this in the context of, is our nation about to fall apart because we have all these people that are going to be evicted? Well, this is a CNBC article. This is the article that he shared that I saw on my feed. Again, this was actually my personal feed. It wasn't even on the political feed. It said how the eviction crisis across the U.S. will look. And I want you to understand that this is dated today. Okay, so what I'm going to show you, there's no excuse for what I'm going to show you, okay? So the main points of this is that there's an impending eviction crisis that will hurt some states more than others. It says African-American Hispanic tenants are especially at risk of losing their homes, and then this article argues that point. But this is the key. This is the key, because this is what everybody is looking at. Because if you share the article, what's going to pop up is this little graph here, okay? Now this graph says facing eviction. And it says renter households unable to pay rent and at risk of eviction as a share of total renter households in tiny letters. Tiny, tiny letters. The big letters just say facing eviction. And then it gives you each state and the percentage. And right here we have Arizona. Arizona, it says 38%. So what they're saying is 38% of Arizonans are facing eviction, except if you read the fine print, it says renter households unable to pay rent and at risk of eviction as a share of total renter households. All right, that's technically true, but that's not what people are going to see. People are going to see facing eviction. They go down to Arizona. It says 38%. Well, this is basically a blatant lie, and I'm going to show you why this is a blatant lie. And this only took me 5 seconds to go on the internet and look at. Of course, I follow Arizona politics to begin with, to a little bit more than the average bear. But we all know that Governor Ducey recently put out this order. This is July 16th. Okay, July 16th. And it says right here, Governor Ducey extends COVID-19 eviction protection, expands rental assistance access. So no, 38% of people in Arizona are not about to lose their homes. The governor has actually extended the order here in Arizona. And I just think that this is an example of media malfeasance. I mean, it's just sickening that they put stuff like that out that's so misleading. And again, the person that I saw sharing this particular article was just talking about how we're near the fall of the republic, that kind of a thing. And I said, hey, I can tell you in my state, this isn't true. I can tell you right now, in my state, this is completely false. In my state, they've extended the executive order until, I believe, October, if I recall correctly from this article. So it's just an example of something that's misleading. Like I said, if you look at the fine print, it's accurate. I mean, these are people that are facing, quote unquote eviction because they are not paying the rent. And by the way, in that article I brought up about the actual order, the one from the Arizona governor's office, they talk about all these different assistance programs where they're trying to help people to pay their rent, even though they're not facing eviction, because there are no evictions happening right now. So basically what they're saying is, even if if you're struggling paying, even though you quote unquote don't have to pay, we're going to try to help you pay anyway. So there's all sorts of programs, and that's just in Arizona, which is not known as a quote unquote social welfare state. I'm sure in other states there are much more advanced programs. But what's your take on all this eviction chatter and everybody and people being afraid of evictions, which I think is a valid concern, but I'm not sure if it's being framed correctly.
Right. Yeah, I do think it's a valid concern, but that number you showed, 38%, is definitely overblown for a couple of reasons. First of all, like you said, that's rental properties. It doesn't talk about people who own their homes. One of the big stories over the past decade since the housing crisis of 2008 is people have a lot more equity in their homes. You have a lot fewer people who are upside down, and that means that they have tools available to them, like home equity loans, where they have a little bit of a buffer. They are not going to be evicted, and they're better able to pay for their homes. So even though the price of homes is higher, and we've talked about how that is a problem because it does put strain on the middle class. You're paying more every month for your mortgage, but people overall, their economic situation is more secure than it was a decade ago. So that's one thing. We're only talking about part of the picture. We're not talking about the whole picture. The other thing is a lot of these people are going to, yes, there are programs in place, so they're getting help paying their rent, which is good. This isn't their fault that the coronavirus happened, and this isn't a permanent situation. This is a crisis. This is an emergency. This is something that we're trying to get through together as a nation, and we're hoping that it will be done soon, and that people will be able to go back to work and they'll be able to pay their own rent. But these are not normal circumstances. This is something we talked about the Federal Reserve a couple weeks ago, where Jerome Powell was lamenting that you have all these businesses going out of business. And what's going on is people have spent decades, generations, building these family businesses in many cases. You're just small mom and pop shop, small businesses. But they put their sweat into it. And they're good businesses. And if coronavirus hadn't happened, this is not usual. This isn't something they could expect. This is the definition of a black swan event. And when coronavirus stops, those businesses that weren't viable, many of them would be viable again. But it's too late. They've already declared bankruptcy. They may not be able to get back on their feet. And so, I absolutely understand what the government is doing here. I understand the risks of inflation and all that. But the government is doing what I think largely has to be done to keep people in their homes. We don't want to see people thrown out on the street. People who are willing to work. It's not like these people don't want to work. They're not just the so-called welfare queens. They haven't done anything wrong. But they are victims of what we hope is a temporary situation. So when the economy comes back and these people go back to work, they'll be able to pay. And here's something that I believe is going to happen. And I haven't heard anybody talk about it, but it just makes sense to me. When you get an eviction, that's a black mark on your record. That significantly impacts your ability going forward to rent something else, to buy another house. It sticks with you. And these forbearance programs, when you enter a forbearance program, that's a black mark, a significant black mark on your record. And I think we're going to have to reevaluate how we look at customers. There may be how we look at potential buyers, potential renters in the housing industry. What kind of forgiveness is there going to be for these people? Because again, they are victims of circumstance. They're not necessarily credit risks going forward. These are people who have been paying their bills, paying their rent, paying their mortgage up until this time. They did what they're supposed to do. And, this isn't the new normal. This is a crisis that we are hoping to get through so we can get back to normal. So that's my take.
Yeah, I did want to, I agree with exactly what you said. But the thing that concerns me is that we have this constant poking of the bear by the media, where the media is constantly trying to evoke the word crisis. I mean, there's a reason that I use that in the banner here. It's always a crisis, and it's always a national crisis. And while, of course, there's national implications to what's going on, the fact of the matter is that most states have been given wide latitude to deal with this crisis as they see fit. which I believe is the correct path because I'm a federalist and that's what I believe in, and I believe in the Constitution. So I think you always try to put a problem at the lowest level possible, in other words, and trying to solve it. To be honest, I would like to see a lot more individual, responsibility with all this. And we've talked about masks, we've talked about all sorts of different things. But the bottom line is, the narrative that the media has is that it's always something that's just happening nationwide. This is the way it is. Congress isn't doing anything, so everything's falling apart, blah, 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 blah. It's just not true. It's just not true. I think many states are responding to this crisis in a very reasonable way, and you can criticize a lot of the individual decisions that they're making. I certainly will criticize the decision-making process. I've talked about that extensively on the show. I don't agree with governors making all these calls. I think at this point, it's been months. There's just no excuse to not get the legislature involved, which also gets a lot of the blame and the criticism off of the governors, because now you have other people that are involved that are actually going to be able to take some of this heat, and that's what should be happening in a crisis situation. I was just thinking about this the other day. It's funny. You think about World War II, and Congress got together and declared war the next day. So what is this argument that the legislature can't be involved in a crisis situation? Now, of course, they were not involved with the internment of the Japanese. That was an executive order. That was a call by the president, and that's the danger. That's the problem that I think we have, and also that the media isn't framing the situation a little bit better and a little bit more accurately. Mm-hmm. It's a national crisis in the sense that, yes, every state is being affected by this, but we have states that to this day never did any kind of a shutdown. There are several states that never shut anything down and still haven't, and have no intention to. So it's like every state is being affected differently because mm-hmm. this is the third largest country on the planet. You know what I mean? So and we have our federal system, and people forget that as well. We do not have a centralized system of government. We don't have a unitary system of government where Washington's decree is just made throughout the land, and it's their way or the highway. That's not how a federal system works. There's different levels of sovereignty between the states, the federal government, and the people, and that's what the Constitution says. So I just hate, and I feel like even this has implications with stuff we're going to talk about later, with these police protests, the George Floyd protests. There's always this sort of narrative to make everything national, when the fact of the matter is, you've got to look at your local government. That means you got to be looking at your city government. If you live in an incorporated area, you got to be looking at your county government. You got to be looking at your state government. You've got to get involved. Stop being lazy and stop letting the mainstream media dictate to you the narrative, because they're creating a narrative based on panic and fear. Yeah,
they are. And if, by the way, we have I have an article if you want to throw it up here, which relates to all of this. And this is Larry Kudlow. I think we all know who Larry Kudlow is. He was an advisor to President Reagan. And now that they're negotiating, because of course the crisis with coronavirus has continued, now that they're negotiating another round of stimulus, another round of relief, really, this isn't about Keynesian stimulus. This is about relief for people who need it, and trying to get people through this without causing unnecessarily collateral damage of the type that Jerome Powell talked about. We don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. We don't want to destroy viable businesses and get people thrown out of their homes unnecessarily. What Kudlow is saying, and there's good reason to think that he's involved in these negotiations because he is a senior advisor to the president. He is saying that he believes that the eviction moratorium will be extended and that there will be more relief checks. All of these things, really have to happen. And, that's not the libertarian solution, but these aren't normal times. This is a pandemic. And by the way, to your point about states' rights, yeah, South Dakota doesn't have to shut down. South Dakota is South Dakota. On the other hand, states like New York and, Washington, California, they've gotten hit harder. And why is that? Well, New York has one large city, and it's the largest city in the country. It's New York City. And California has 3 mega cities, LA, San Francisco, and San Diego. Washington, well, they have Seattle. which is on the coast, and was the first to get hit. And because the population is so concentrated, relatively speaking, relative to other states, especially relative to Texas and Florida, which are now getting hit hard. We shouldn't be all that surprised, how this has progressed. It has to do with where your population is, and how dense it is. It's density and of your population overall, and density of your cities. Do you have a bunch of, like Texas, a bunch of cities, but they're all spread out? They're not all on the coast. So yeah, different states are in different situations, and they have to respond accordingly. They have to take the action that is responsible and prudent given their current situation.
I do want to make the point, because you also talked about it, like this is not, quote, a libertarian solution. But the one thing that I do like about the first round of stimulus, and we're talking about the possibility of a second round of stimulus, I do like the fact that unlike TARP, we have money that's going directly to people instead of to just corporations. Now, of course, we had that still happen anyway. We still had corporations that were bailed out. We talked about in a previous segment weeks ago, we were talking about the PPE, the loans, the loans for small business. And some of them were going to companies that just had no reason to be asking for them. We even covered a story where like Shake Shack gave their money back because they realized that like we shouldn't have done this, and we didn't realize, we thought this was just free money, and the next thing you know, within a week it was all depleted, and there were actual real small businesses that needed the money and they couldn't get it. So that's what happens. That's what happens, unfortunately, with corporate welfare. No matter whether it's a crisis, no matter what's going on, it's always administered that way. So the one thing I'll give the last round of stimulus is that there was a great amount of it that went directly to people that had lost their jobs, things like that. But I also talk about in my own experience, I have a very close friend that lost his job in the middle of all this, and he could not qualify for unemployment. They tried to say that he had lost his job for cause, and he was not entitled to unemployment, and for some reason or another, he couldn't seem to get the COVID relief either. You know what I mean? It's just a weird situation. When it comes to bureaucracies, that's the way it works. So you have these sort of blanket statements where people are like, okay, well, people are getting this, getting that. Well, in reality, a lot of people don't get this and that. There are caveats that come with these things, and we say that people are going to get this and that, and they don't. I mean, that's just the reality of it.
Mm-hmm. What industry is he in?
He was in sales. He was involved in, actually technically utilities, but he was involved with sales. I don't want to get any more specific than that. But he was involved with sales, specifically for a utility type company. It was just a really bizarre situation, because I believe coincidences happen all the time, but I don't trust coincidences. That's a line actually from Star Trek, from Deep Space Nine. One of the characters, he says that, coincidences happen all the time. I'm saying there's not coincidences, but I never trust coincidences. I don't trust coincidences.
Well, yeah, more likely than not. So, all right. I kind of want to move on to the next story, if that's okay. I want to talk about the GOP being canceled, and I have a discussion of it that I wanted to throw up just to sort of get it started. And this is somebody who is obviously a big Trump supporter. Says they're feeling emotional about the GOP convention canceled, which you shouldn't feel emotional. It's going to be fine. They're still going to nominate Donald Trump for president. It's fine. There's nothing. This is normal. It's just fine. The convention isn't canceled. As we talked about the Democratic National Convention last week, the Democratic National Convention isn't canceled either. Yeah, a lot of it's going to be done virtually because everything's being done virtually this year. It's the year of coronavirus. I mean, my goodness, this is normal. It's going to be okay. But, you can see the responses, and I think these are really indicative of where we are right now as a country. And that's why I wanted to bring this up, because, it's so disappointing to see these things. Florida virus testing and reports are false. Why are we falling for the lies? Look, if Donald Trump is willing to cancel his party in Jacksonville, Florida, because that's what it was. He had festivities in Jacksonville, Florida, related to the convention. The convention's still going on. Okay, it's going to be in North Carolina. It's fine. But if Donald Trump is canceling it, he doesn't want to do this. And he's the president. He has the best people, the best advisors advising him. And if he is making this call, you could be certain he knows for sure that these are not lies. This is not a hoax. These are, these people really are dying in Florida, and it really is dangerous. And the president really does believe it was dangerous. We saw today that his national security advisor, O'Brien, was diagnosed with COVID. So, that's not the first person close to the president who's been diagnosed. The next comment is, well, what the F is getting out of hand. Okay. I think he has a new advisor giving him bad advice. This sounds to me very much like, the old saying, oh, if only the Tsar knew, right? Have you heard that expression? When the peasants would some bad thing would happen, right? Some local official would, be tromping around Russia with their troops, and they, bayonet a few peasants, and the peasants, couldn't believe that their Tsar, whom they loved, the father of his nation, would do such a bad thing. If only the Tsar knew. This is the kind of I hate to use a Marxist phrase, but false consciousness that we're seeing on the right now. That they believe if the president does something that they don't expect, here he's led them, and he has led them on. The president has definitely led on his followers, told them, not explicitly, but he has suggested that it is a hoax. He's suggested that it will just disappear. And we've seen so many people say, oh, this will go away right after Election Day. It's a Democratic hoax. Fauci needs to go. He's telling lies. All this stuff. So when the president takes it seriously, when he puts on a mask, what they fall back on is there must be some Rasputin in the White House who is telling the president to do something really bad. No, this is real. Coronavirus is real. It has really killed 140,000 Americans and perhaps more. And thankfully there was one person, who said it will be online, not canceled. But you can see that's basically the ratio, right? 75% of people are just completely tuned out of reality. This isn't a scientific poll, but I think this largely agrees with, supports what we're experiencing out in the real world, that 75% of people on the right now are just checked out intellectually. They have decided that this is a hoax, it's fake, the left is just pumping this for their own reasons, and they can't accept that this is really dangerous, and it really has killed 140,000 Americans, and it will likely have killed more than 200,000 by the time we get to the election. So, the denialism is cute up until the point when we hit reality, and this is the danger of downplaying. And I kind of understand why Trump has done it, because he knows that this hurts him fairly or unfairly. People blame the president when the economy takes a tumble. And he doesn't have much control over that, and the president doesn't have much control over the spread of coronavirus. But it has hurt him much more that he has suggested that it was just going to go away over and over again, that he has downplayed it, that he has refused to wear a mask, that he has encouraged his followers to believe that it's a hoax, that masks don't work. We have seen that over and over again. This just irrational thinking that because masks don't, we saw this with Dr. Fauci at the Nationals game this past week, that he took off his mask when he sat down. He was sitting with two other people whom he clearly knows. If you're going to be sitting, if you're going to be in close contact with these people on an ongoing basis, that mask isn't going to protect you. If they have COVID, you're going to get COVID if you're in close enough contact with another person for a long enough period of time. And so there was nothing hypocritical about that, but people are losing their minds, and it is, to even call it groupthink doesn't explain it. You have the craziest voices are being pumped into, back, they're being the ones that are amplified. And not to go off on a tangent here, but this is what our enemies like China and Russia like. These are the kinds of insane messages that Chinese and Russian propaganda, the bots that do retweet stuff and put stuff on Facebook, these are the kinds of insane messages that they like to amplify and get out there, because they know that it hurts our nation to have us losing our minds and unable to engage with reality. So yeah, I'm so disgusted by the denialism, and I just had to call it out.
Yeah, I have a different take because I understand the denialism very well. On this show in particular, we were advocating for masks before anybody else was, including the CDC. And I do blame Dr. Fauci and the medical community for the terrible information they were putting out simply because they wanted to have the PPE for themselves. I believe that very strongly. I also believe I laid it out, the 3 reasons I thought that they were not advocating masks at the time when we were advocating for it before everybody else was. And that's that's the main reason. In fact, even the Surgeon General basically acknowledged that. When they changed, he basically tacitly acknowledged that's exactly why we weren't telling people to wear masks, because we were trying to get it for ourselves. The other part of it is, and we see it, anybody who's gone out, because in Arizona now, pretty much anywhere you go, it's mandatory masks. It's certainly mandatory masks in my community. People don't wear them properly. People do not wear them properly. I mean, that's just the bottom line. You see people all the time with the mask underneath their nose. That's a huge thing that I see all the time. People constantly touching their faces, constantly taking the masks on and off, even when they're in a grocery store or something like that. People don't wear them properly. That's just go out and look. I mean, that's just the way it is. There's absolute truth in that concern. And then the other thing is, I said it's a cultural bias. There is a cultural bias in the West, because this was not just the United States. This was the United States, Canada, and Europe. We were the ones that said no masks. In South America, in Africa, in Asia, they were all wearing masks. And to this day, you look at the rates in some of these other places, especially like Africa, and while you could chalk that up to the fact that many of these countries aren't as, quote, international as other nations are, pretty much every major capital in the world has a pretty large extent of international travel, if from nothing else, just from the diplomats and things like that. They just don't have the numbers that other people do. So I don't argue the effectiveness of masks. What I argue is that we were lied to, and there's no reason to trust this man, and that's why people don't want to trust the CDC. I can remember a few weeks ago. I think people have forgotten that. So the entire debate has been flipped on us. It's been completely flipped. And then you see things where people are saying, for instance, that, and this is a real thing. This is a real thing when you talk about some of these partisan people, and they get doctors involved with this stuff too. At least that's what I see their little hashtags or I'm sorry, their names, and there's an MD next to it. Who knows whether that's true or not? You see it all the time. And they'll say incredibly stupid things like, doing a George Floyd protest is fine. You won't get COVID there. But if you do a mask protest, you will. That is the stupidest thing I've ever heard in my life. So you have these hyper-partisan debates that are happening in the middle of this. Now, I do have an article related directly to the election that I did want to talk about because I think this is relevant, and it goes right along with us talking about the convention.
Sure. Well, if we could, there's 2 things that you mentioned that I wanted to jump on about the coronavirus. One is about Africa. Africa, a lot of people think it's all desert, or it's all jungle, or it's all grassland, which is obviously not true. It's a very diverse and large continent. But also it's much more than people realize, a very urban continent, because the major cities, just the way that their economy is structured, the major cities are huge. And this is also true in poorer parts of Asia, because people who need to work, unless you're a farmer, you can be out in the countryside. But if you're going to work, you can't work from home. They don't have a distributed suburb centric economy like the United States does. So their cities are denser. And like you said, they have a fair amount of international travel. It only takes one person with the virus to spread it to 10 people, and then it's 100, and then it's 1,000. And it goes from there. So, the idea that Africa is immune simply because of what's their geography is nonsense. It's just not true.
And the other reason I bring up Africa is when we were talking about this mask debate, I actually saw images where they had supermarkets in Africa where they had a security guard at the door with a mask and a thermometer, with one of those non-touch digital thermometers to check people as they came into the supermarket. And all the supermarket workers were all had masks. And that was when the CDC was telling us no masks. And we still had our grocery workers out there on the real front line, because the front line's in the field. The front line is not in a hospital. A hospital is a quote unquote sterile, controlled environment. The front line is on the street. That's what the front line is. And you had grocery workers out there with no protection and being told they still had to work. And this was in the early days when we really didn't know what the hell was going on. And now we have a little bit better handle on it. But at the time, they weren't giving them any protection, totally threw them under the bus. I remember that. If everybody else wants to forget it, I'm not. But the thing is, I do want to get back to because we wanted to talk about the election. Obviously, this is related to COVID. Notre Dame has announced that they are not going to host the first presidential debate due to coronavirus. And I do think this is the kind of thing that gets people a little bit sad, a little bit upset. Notre Dame, for me, has a great reputation. I've always rooted for Notre Dame. I actually attended the University of Portland for a semester, and that's also a Holy Cross school. For people that don't know, Notre Dame is run by the Holy Cross, which are sort of a friendly rival to the Jesuit order in the Catholic Church. And I went to a Holy Cross school, which is University of Portland, small school, had no football team. So I always had an affinity for Notre Dame. I think a lot of people growing up Catholic, they have a huge affinity for Notre Dame football and Notre Dame in general. And it's disappointing to me to see that they went ahead and they canceled the debate. They were supposed to host the first presidential debate September 29th, and now it's going to be at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland. That big name school. Again,
that is a big name school, actually.
I'm sorry.
It's not as well known as Notre Dame.
I've just never heard of it.
No,
so,
it's a highly ranked academic school. It's not a big sports powerhouse, though.
I've never heard of it, Pete, and I understand you're more intellectual than I am, but still, I'm just telling you, I've never heard of it. A lot of people haven't heard of it. Notre Dame, everybody's heard of it, and I'm disappointed that they decided to do this, because obviously, and this article even says, they have not decided at Case Western what the limitations are going to be, because they're going to look at what the situation is as it happens, about whether there's going to be an audience, all those kind of things. Because that's at first what I thought. I thought maybe one of the candidates was insisting on an audience, and they didn't want to do that. I don't know, but the article clearly states that they haven't decided that yet. That has not been decided. So I just think it's kind of a punk move. I mean, I'll just put it out that way, for Notre Dame not to host this. It is necessary for our government and our democracy to go forward. And the fact that we're not going to, I talked about this at the beginning, when COVID really started happening at the beginning. We say freedom isn't free. We say that all the time. It's not. We talk about the sacrifices of people in combat and things like that died for this country. But, we're too afraid to have a controlled environment, which they could absolutely control the environment of the debate. And the Notre Dame says, we're not going to do it. No, we're not going to do it. It's too dangerous. It's too dangerous to have a presidential debate, apparently. And I have a problem with that. And I think a lot of people have a problem with that, and it upsets them. It scares them. And I think in some respects, it's justifiable, because it's just not good for a healthy constitutional republic.
Yeah. They could. I don't understand why Notre Dame cannot host it. I understand why they might not want to have a crowd, or at least not have a large crowd. I mean, but you don't need to have a crowd. You can just have the candidates there that's really all you need, right? You need candidates and you need a moderator. And typically the candidates don't stand close to each other, and they don't stand close to the moderator. So, what on earth could be the danger? It seems like logistically this is, it'd have to be scaled down, but there's no reason to think, think that they couldn't host it, or at least I can't think of any reason. It seems like a big overreaction. They're going to have to host it somewhere. I mean, they could host it on Zoom. I don't know. I don't know what you do at this point. That would be interesting, though, if they did have a virtual debate. But
so they could emulate the Libertarian Party.
Yeah, that'd definitely be a way to do it. By the way, could you throw up the information I just brought? U.S. News and World Review, number 40 in the nation. They're a private institution that says that they're a research university. So I guess that's how they built their name. Is their it's kind of like Hillsdale College. They're not going to win the NCAA tournament in any given year.
I've heard of Hillsdale College. I've absolutely heard of Hillsdale College, so I don't want to hear it again.
Yeah. So, anyway. All right. I just looked at my university, the one that I went to, and we're not ranked that high. So, but anyway, we are ranked number 6 for regional universities in the South. So that's something, right?
That is something. That's absolutely something. South is a big place.
Yeah. Christopher Newport. All right. Well, were there any other stories that you had before we go into the Portland stuff?
No, I think that's
okay.
Our fun big finale.
All right. And we don't have, well, maybe you have an article that you'd like to share related to it. And because they're just, I put out an article that I'm hoping is going to be published here. I'm not going to say where, because if it doesn't get published, I know. I'll just submit it somewhere else and say that's where I sent it initially. But, I have some thoughts on this. So if you have an article or something that you would like to share, some facts you'd like to bring to the table, and then we can sort of get into the discussion, because I think this is more of a philosophical topic than it is almost than a news story.
Well, I saw this, and it just it's one of those things that it just seems to get worse and worse and worse, because this article doesn't even just center on Portland. This is a CNN article. It says peaceful protests and violent clashes erupted this weekend. Boy, that's a weird title, isn't it? Here's what happened in six cities. You got to love that spin. Peaceful protests and violent clashes erupted. Yeah, that's spin. I'm sorry, that's spin. Especially when you read the actual article and you see what's actually been happening. So, of course, they do address Portland. They talked about what's been going on there. We've talked about that as well. Conflict with, especially with federal agents trying to protect the courthouse from being destroyed. We see there's a picture, I think, of the Wall of Moms and all the wonderful things going on over there. But they talk about some of the other cities that maybe people haven't heard about. I know I haven't heard about as much. We were just talking about Seattle. It says dozens of people arrested in Seattle in demonstrations this weekend. This again they said that this was a response supposedly to U.S. Customs and Border Protection that was sent there to stand by to help protect federal facilities. Because guess what, folks? The federal government's not going to let you burn down their buildings. I know that's news, isn't it? That's absolutely news that the federal government's not going to let you burn down their buildings.
News to me.
Apparently, it's news to a lot of people. But then you have some much more serious situations going on in some of these other places. There were protests in Louisville. I've talked about Louisville before because I've tried to show how it's interesting how the protests against religious freedom and the protests against police, or for police reform, however you view it, they've been treated completely differently. And yet they've basically had bad responses to both. This is where they actually had a National Guardman actually shot someone, which was a very grim milestone in terms of all these protests. But they have a group now called the Not Fucking Around Coalition. That's exactly what they're called. That's what they're actually called. And apparently they're very much going for a Black Panther vibe. You can see in this picture, you can see these gentlemen are clearly trying to provide some sort of uniformity in terms of the way that they are presenting themselves. And there was a shooting, and nobody knows who shot or why. And this is something that's become a trend that we're seeing more and more, is another person got shot, and we don't know who did it. We don't know why. There's no outstanding circumstances, according to the local police department. It's just some sort of random shooting happened in the middle of this. We're seeing this more and more, where we're having these random shootings happening in the middle of the protest. This happened several times in that Seattle autonomous zone, or whatever it was called, where they had shootings happening there as well. And that's why Seattle finally went in there and broke it all up. just because it was literally just becoming a chaotic, no man's land of anarchy. So we've had the situation now where people are being shot at these protests randomly. We don't even know who it is or why. I believe there was another one here in Aurora, in Colorado. This one, the police did catch somebody, and they said actually the person was being cooperative. So at least they're hopefully soon figure out what their motivation was. But we don't know. Or at this point, there's so many chaotic things happening because there are rivalries within these different protesting groups. And we see that, and then we also see counter protesting. That's something that I've been really concerned about. I mentioned that on the last show, is that you have these situations where you have protesters and counter protesters coming together, and it's never good. It's never good. They cannot be respectful of each other's positions. So we're seeing more and more of this kind of trend, and it really disturbs me. And I don't know. I don't know what the future holds when it comes to that.
Yeah, and if we saw the armed protests in Michigan, where they did break into the state house. They didn't hurt anybody. They didn't shoot anybody. They didn't, certainly nobody was killed in those protests. But this is different, isn't it? This is very much an escalation of the kind of chaos and violence that we've seen, and it is really disturbing to see. But this is yeah. What can you say about it?
Well, I can say it's gonna end badly if it continues. I can say that. I can make that bold prediction if it continues on the path that it's going. And I'm not the only one to say this. Pete, you and I have talked about the error of some folks that we know that are very concerned, that have been in the middle of these kinds of protests, where they've had the protests and the counter protests going on, and how dangerous it becomes, especially because we know that in that situation both sides were armed. So that there was a possibility for a real tragedy to happen, right on the streets, here in Arizona, so if it can happen here, it can happen anywhere. And it's already happening in other places. That's my point. And it's something that if people don't start to get a saner head on their shoulders and start to de-escalate a little bit, that's a popular word, by the way, in police reform, has been for a long time. Right. De-escalation training. How about citizens get some de-escalation training? Wouldn't that be helpful right now?
Yes, but let's be clear. This isn't incidental. These protesters, this is not all protesters, but these groups that are increasing the violence in these situations are doing so intentionally. They're, the idea that they would even want to de-escalate, I think, is a misunderstanding of their goals. This is not incidental. It's not just these things got out of control. Their goal, I believe, the goal of these groups that are, out of control, that are attacking police officers, that are attacking federal buildings, is to provoke a larger reaction. So the idea that they would de-escalate would suggest that is somehow their goal, to have a peaceful protest, and that's just not their goal. Their goal is violence.
Yeah, I think, it's important to draw a contrast that many of the people that show up to these events are, in fact, peaceful protesters that are legitimately upset, legitimately want to see change. Unfortunately, a lot of them are not terribly well informed. A lot of them don't really know what that reform even looks like. I can tell you that right off the bat. We've had discussions about defund the police and what does that actually look like. A lot of these people have no idea. They have no clue. You can see that from politicians talking about it. They have no clue what that actually means. There have been actual concrete proposals that I've seen that are, in my opinion, kind of hilarious. There's been talk of a new sort of crisis intervention unit in New Mexico, where they're going to be sending unarmed officers to deal with a lot of issues that police normally deal with. There's talk, I know of, I can't remember which California city, where they're talking about removing police officers from traffic enforcement. Any police officer is just going to look at that like, oh my God, you are out of your mind. Traffic stops are one of the most dangerous things you will ever do in law enforcement. Because there are so many unknowns and situations can turn on you in a second.
The idea that you would have unarmed civilians doing traffic stops is the most asinine thing I've ever heard of in my life. But those are the kind of quote unquote concrete proposals that are out there. And they're just sort of spread around a little bit here and there because nobody really takes them seriously. Because it's just a phrase. It's a phrase that unites people and gets them together and riles them up, and that kind of a thing, without any real clear policy other than to foment chaos. That's what it seems like so often with a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, I don't know that it's necessarily wrong to send out officers unarmed in some situations. I mean, the British police, and I don't have any experience as a law enforcement officer, but British police do not carry guns, and they seem to be able to do their jobs.
Okay, then give up your Second Amendment rights, because that's what they did. Put that into context, Pete, because that's what they did. The reason that British police are not armed, by the way, it's also a misnomer to say they are not armed, because they do have armed response. There are many armed response officers in the UK. So that's not exactly true. But the majority, you're right, the majority of officers do not carry guns in the UK. I believe with the exception of Northern Ireland, where they still do. But for the most part, they do not. That's absolutely true. You have armed response units. And the fact of the matter is, they do not have Second Amendment rights in the UK. They have eliminated their gun rights.
Yeah, but that came later, as I understand it. That their police officers were disarmed long before they gave up their Second Amendment rights, that you were allowed to own a gun, I think, well into the 90s, and that's when you had some mass shootings, and there was this big public backlash. And so I don't know that those two things are related, although I can understand why you would.
It's absolutely related.
Logically, well, I think they're logically related, but I don't know that as a matter of policy. I don't think there was a cause and effect relationship there.
There was a cause and effect in that they responded to numerous mass shootings with basically banning guns. They had mass shootings in the UK. The way that they addressed them was they took away people's right to have a firearm, because there was a cultural shift, just as we've seen here. Mass shootings are not something that have been commonplace throughout the inception of our country. It's been something that's become much more prevalent in the last 20 years or so. And the same thing,
police officers were disarmed before that, then the disarmed police officers did not cause the mass shootings and did not cause the guns to be banned. Right? Or are you suggesting that disarmed police caused the mass shootings?
I'm suggesting that you're in many communities in the United States, they had disarmed police throughout the history of our country as well. It was not commonplace for all municipal police officers to carry firearms. That's something that occurred later as time went on. What I'm trying to say is that there was a cultural shift that happened over there that's happened here as well, where you see this sort of culture of death where people have no value for human life. They go out and they do these crazy things. In the UK, their response was to ban all firearms, essentially. You cannot get a firearm in the UK unless you have a special permit. It's almost impossible to get it if you live in a municipal area. Little easier if you live in a rural area. Still very difficult, because they have a culture that says don't have guns. Right. And yet that doesn't mean they've eliminated gun violence. They still have gun violence. They have terrorist attacks with bombs and things like that. The subway bombings and things like that have happened in London. It's not like they eliminated all violence by doing this. But my point is, there was a cultural shift that happened there, and their response was to get rid of guns completely. Okay. That's not going to happen in the United States. I can just tell you that. That's not going to happen in the United States. It's certainly not going to happen without a lot of bloodshed and a civil war. It's certainly not going to happen. Yeah. It's not going to go down like it went in the UK. But what I'm trying to say is UK, they do not respect gun rights. And it is very rare for a person to own a gun. In the United States, it's commonplace. So the idea that you would have traffic officers, for instance, stopping random people to issue citations or to administer DUI enforcement, I don't know how far they actually want to go with this. But the thing is, to do things like that, and they're not going to be armed, is absolutely asinine, completely unsafe, totally asinine.
Right. Okay. But do you agree that it's not crazy that we would have unarmed officers respond to some situations?
Name the situation. Get specific. That's the problem here.
Well,
Is nobody wants to get specific, and when they do, it seems
that's
like
what I'm saying.
It's ludicrous.
Right.
Get specific.
Well, okay. Gosh, a wellness check. They believe that hey, did somebody die in their apartment? Are they still there? Police might respond to that. You wouldn't necessarily bring a gun to that.
It's a great job for the fire department, but they don't want it, Pete. That's the point. Also, people forget that. There's a reason why officers do these things. They didn't always.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Police didn't always.
Okay. So there's a case where you say you probably should be the fire department, and I agree. That makes sense. Maybe that's a better thing for the fire department to do. But police officers do respond to those kinds of calls.
Why the fire department doesn't want to do it, Pete, is because they believe it's dangerous. They do not want to be breaking into somebody's house because they're afraid they're going to be shot as they enter it. That's the truth. That's the reality. Even in medical calls where we knew, I can give you a scenario, real life scenario where you have somebody, it's the I've fallen and I can't get up scenario. Okay. Literally, right. I've gone on these calls. I have gone on these calls. It's the I've fallen and I can't get up. And fire department calls and says, we're staging. You go up to the door. You know what I mean? Because they're afraid of the old woman that's slipped and fell and can't get up. And literally we're arguing about who's going to break the door because they don't want to break the door because, then we might have to pay for it, which isn't even true because it's a city that ends up having to pay for it. So it becomes incredibly stupid. The bottom line is they are scared and don't want to go through the door. It's absolutely asinine, some of these things that go on, but there's a reason for it. And again, the reason is because so many things that used to be done by other people. Heck, there was a time that your neighbor would do that, Pete. There's a time that your neighbor would go over there and open the door. Yeah. Probably because they had a key. They didn't even have to break in.
Sure.
But because we've had such a societal collapse, a breakdown in our culture, these things don't happen anymore. And a lot of these jobs that absolutely traditionally were never done by police are done by police now. But that's because nobody wants to do it. Nobody else wants to do that. And I'm giving you a classic real life example of that is that they don't want to be the ones to break down that door. Mm-hmm. And you would think, hey, don't you want to get your toys out and do this? Don't you guys like doing this kind of stuff?
Sure.
But apparently not, at least not in all cases. And they just don't want that job.
Okay. Well, that's a really interesting topic, and maybe we can come back to it next week. In fact, I'm pretty sure that we will, because I don't see the situation in Portland turning itself around in the next 7 days. But I did want to talk about, I know that we have a bit of a different take on this Portland situation, that, the officers are defending federal property. And I understand there's a legitimate federal interest at stake here. That said, and there is and I forget the name of the organization, but there is a group of, they're kind of federal police officers who are normally tasked with doing this. But of course, they've been overwhelmed, just like the police in Portland have been overwhelmed, or in many cases ordered to stand down, which is just mind blowing that the mayor is doing this, that he's tying the police officers' hands behind their back. But I would say that this is a trap. The federal government should allow the courthouse to burn and then send the bill to Portland. I mean, honestly, at this point, because the protesters who are doing this, they want a federal response. This did not start with Portland. When President Trump got into office, the first thing they did was try to organize worker walkouts. Now that seems a little strange, right? Like, didn't you think that was weird that President Trump gets into office and hey, workers got to strike all of a sudden? You had a day without an immigrant, a day without a woman, a day without, and they would have kept going, except for those first two were such flops. And why were they doing that? They were doing that because this is a long-tested socialist strategy in order to antagonize right-wing populists. And they were hoping, and I think they were wrong, they were hoping that Trump would be Hitler, or he'd be Mussolini, and he would come in with federal troops and he would crack down and try to get the trains running again. And that, of course, that didn't happen. What happened was nobody didn't go to work because guess what? People have to be paid. So this idea that you're going to have a national general strike was always a fantasy. This strategy of attacking federal property in order to incite a federal response, is the strategy is to try to get the federal government to respond. And frankly, it doesn't matter. If they burn down a federal court building, it's just a building. Move the trial somewhere else. And like I said, send the bill to the city of Portland, the city of Seattle. If they can't control their city, that's their problem. But what's going on right now is very dangerous for a number of reasons. You have these police officers who are they're not police officers and they're not military, and nobody knows what they are. They're somewhere in the middle, right? And that's a problem. But they're not wearing ID badges. Why aren't they? And they're not identifying themselves. They're not like whipping out a badge. I understand it's a dangerous situation. There are good reasons for all of what they're doing. But still, strategically, this is dumb, because what's happening is why do they not have ID badges, right? Because they're afraid of being doxxed. They're afraid the officers will be doxxed, which has happened. You've had ICE officers doxxed, and they've been harassed. Their family has been harassed after incidents in Portland, and I believe Seattle as well. Definitely in Portland. That's where you had the ICE vehicle was firebombed, as it was described in the media. Okay, they're renting these vehicles. So people show up in a Dodge Chrysler, a Chrysler Caravan, and they're pulling these protesters off the street, ostensibly their arrest. But what stops somebody from going to the Army or Navy surplus store and dressing up? Because these aren't familiar uniforms. We don't know who these people are. What's to stop you or me? I mean, besides our conscience, from doing exactly this and pretending to be police officers if they're not identifying themselves? How do we know that these are legitimate arrests? This is why no-knock raids are dangerous. This is why SWAT teams oftentimes cause huge problems for police agencies. Not to say they're not necessary, but these aren't even SWAT teams. At least are police officers, and they have a mission to serve and protect. Like I said, these aren't police officers, and they're not the military. So is their mission to serve and protect? Are they supposed to act like police officers, or are they supposed to act like the military? And if we start piercing that boundary, you've been on both sides of that. The job of the military is very different than that of police. And to pierce that barrier is enormously dangerous. And it's something that the socialist left, these Marxist nut jobs, is exactly what they want. They hate police, they hate law and order, and they want to say, police officers are fascists, police officers are oppressors. I don't care if Portland wants to elect a peacenik hippie who's going to let City Hall burn. Fine, I couldn't care less. I'm not going to move to Portland. This is within a few. This isn't the whole city, by the way. This is a few blocks of Portland. They've chosen these symbolic targets strategically to elicit exactly this kind of response. And Trump is doing this for short-term political gain. He thinks that he's going to get a bump in the polls. That hasn't happened at all, and it probably will not happen. My prediction is that this is further going to cement opposition to the president. It's going to be a loser for him. But he thinks he's going to run on law and order. That's not going to work for a number of reasons. I mean, first of all, the pardons he's handing out undermine that message. But nobody is looking at this and saying this is a great thing that's happening. This has been going on for 50 days. We let the state and the city handle it, and they haven't been able to handle it. And honestly, at this point, that's their problem. But there are so many issues, and it's not that this violates the law. It's not that this violates the Constitution. It's that this chips away at the broad, unwritten Constitution that we have, that at the traditions that we have. That why were the founding fathers so afraid of a standing army? They weren't afraid of a standing army because they didn't want to have professional soldiers fighting wars. They were afraid of a standing army because the Redcoats had been used as a national federal police force in the colonies. And when we look south of our border, we look at Mexico, we look at how they have a federal police force. We have to ask, is that what we want to be? Do we want to have federal policing? Because historically, policing has always been local. And when we call an insurrection, we go in hard, right? We actually call out the military, and it's very clear this is the military. This isn't these aren't paramilitary groups. These aren't police agencies. This is the military, and we are restoring law and order. And when the mission is done, they go home. But what's going on right now, in my opinion, is strategically idiotic. And I do think it opens the door to, not only, hoaxes, but it opens the door to potentially, people could be arrested and then we don't know what happens to them. What happens if something happens to them while they're in custody? If you know where they're going, if you know who arrested them, it's the Seattle PD or the Portland PD, well, then it's going to be, who has custody of them, where they're going. But if you just have a patchwork quilt of different federal agencies and they're not identifying themselves, they could be anywhere. And I think that creates some serious problems. And I don't know that any of these issues are being adequately addressed by the president. I don't think he's really thought through the long-term consequences of what this is going to do to the country.
Yeah, I actually understand what you're talking about when you talk about strategic blunders and kind of falling into somebody else's narrative. I don't dispute that for a second. I think that you're onto something right there, because that's just what's happening. But I did want to put this out there because
Sure.
I tried to look into this issue a little bit more as far as this idea of these federal agents that aren't identifying them and all that kind of thing. Well, this is a NBC News article, and it says right here, Justice Department Inspector General investigating agency's response in Portland and D.C. So there is a process. It is happening right now. This is an ongoing investigation by the Inspector General from the U.S. Justice Department, and eventually we will get answers. That's the way government works. That's the way law-abiding government works. But I will not concede to you that we should just let the courthouses be burned down. That's just not going to happen. I will not concede that point. Hey, I know where this can go. I know my history in a much different context, where the federal government was much smaller. When the Confederates fired on Fort Sumter, that started the Civil War, and that's exactly where we could be headed in this situation. But I am not going to concede the point there, because the fact of the matter is, this is federal property, and this is not a situation where we're talking about a national park or something like that, where we can dispute, like the other BLM, Bureau of Land Management. We know a lot about that. You know what I mean? We have a lot of friends that know a lot about that. We have friends that were there during those types of protests and things like that. That kind of situation gets very ambiguous, because I don't believe that that's a constitutional federal land, because the Constitution is very specific about the circumstances under which the federal government can own land. And national parks is not one of them. These large reserves is not one of them. Courthouses is one of them. Courthouses is definitely one of them. Post offices is definitely one of them. Military bases, definitely one of them. And the federal government has an obligation and has every right and duty, not the state government, not the local government. It's the federal government that has the duty and has the right to protect those buildings to the best of their ability. And it's not a simple matter of just setting up shop somewhere else, Pete. Come on. They'll just burn that place down too. You'll set a very, very bad precedent. But I did want to point that out, that the Inspector General is on the case as far as what you're talking about, because I have questions about that as well. And that's why it's important for people to get involved, because you have to follow those things. Because what happens is that story and the results of that Inspector General's investigation ends up on page 9 of the proverbial newspaper. It gets buried. Something similar happened with the Navy. I saw this in the Navy, because I was a master at arms in the Navy, so I was involved with security forces in the Navy, and there were all sorts of Inspector General reports that came out later showing all the deficiencies in security that I saw the first day I was on a Navy base, and I saw all the deficiencies in security and how lapsed they were and all that kind of thing. But then that report got buried, and that's what happens, unfortunately. So there is a process. That's the kind of thing that you got to look at. That's the kind of thing that you got to have flagged on your radar to see, what does he say at the conclusion of his investigation? What are his findings going to be? Because a lot of this, I think, is just it's conjecture. It's one side saying this, the other side saying this, without anybody really truly kind of seeing what's actually going on. Because a lot of times there are abuses. That certainly at the federal level, there are definitely abuses in law enforcement. It happens all the time. We know that. This isn't theory. The FBI was used for political operations for decades, and still to this day, many people argue that the FBI is being used for political purposes. We know that with the situation that's been alleged with the spying that was done on the Trump campaign, where they were using the FBI and other services to spy on him. So,
or in an extreme case, the horrible letters, I believe that was recently declassified. Certainly the first time I heard of it was about a year ago. The letter that they sent to Dr. King advising him to kill himself.
Right. That's a perfect
terrific
example. A perfect example. And so we know that happens. But we also know a lot of this stuff comes out later. Sometimes it takes decades. Sometimes it takes a long time. But in this case, I would say put some faith in that Inspector General and actually read his report when it comes out. How about that?
Yeah. Look, it'd be like if Obama were doing this, the right would be up in arms. The fact is, you have BORTAC, which is the Border Patrol Tactical Unit, is out there, and you have like I say, a patchwork quilt of other agencies that don't normally do this, and they're not trained, and who knows what's going to happen. This looks to me like this could go really bad. Inspector generals are great, but you know what? When things get out of control, not just in the United States but around the world, oftentimes it starts with empowering previously obscure agencies, police type units, to start, doing things like this. And I think if the president is serious, if he believes that a federal response is required, then it wouldn't. He can declare it an insurrection, and he can call in the actual military. The actual military has the principle of civilian control, and there are lots of historical checks that we have built up over the past 2.5 centuries. We don't worry about our military going rogue, but I don't know that we have a culture at BORTAC that we can rely on to not commit abuses in the way that we can with our military.
Well, I would actually, I can't concede that either, because I know for a fact one of the issues that's happened is that the DOD doesn't want to deal with this kind of stuff because they know accidents happen. We had the situation with the National Guard in Louisville where they shot someone. So they don't want that. They don't want to put themselves in that position because they don't see themselves as being good for that role. There's that old saying Rush Limbaugh used to say, which is the military is good at going at breaking things, blowing things up.
Kill people and break things.
Yeah.
So
and I'm telling you that debate has happened at the highest levels, and the DOD, that's kind of their position. They know the National Guard is kind of stuck in the middle, and that is in a lot of ways a paramilitary force. It's a hybrid force. It's not 100% military. It's not 100% law enforcement. It's in the middle. Yeah. It absolutely is in the middle. So it's.
I think this is enormously constitutionally dangerous, and I see this just spiraling out of control. I think this is a terrible idea.
And you may be right. But I think it's a terrible idea to burn down courthouses too. I think that's a terrible idea.
Yeah. Well, I think these protesters know what they're doing. I think they don't like our Constitution, and this was exactly what they were hoping for. So they oh boy. So all right. Well, with that said, I think we've talked that to death. I think it's very clear where we stand on these issues. So with that, my name is Pete Maines. I'm here with my co-host, as always, Eric Alexander. And until next week, you keep flying free.